In this video lesson, we'll discuss the end of the Civil War and the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. We'll begin with the siege of Vicksburg in 1863. The summer of 1863 saw another important Union victory in the West, in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg is an overlook on the Mississippi River. It was one of the last areas that prevented the Union Army from controlling the entire river and successfully dividing the South, which was one of the prongs of the Anaconda Plan. Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to the town, firing on it for hours and hours each day. The mostly women, elderly, and children in the town sought refuge in the caves along the river. Their food supply was gone. They had to eat dogs, horses, mules, and rats before surrendering the day after the victory at Gettysburg on July 4th, 1863. Conditions in the South were quickly deteriorating as well. The South was quickly running out of men, firearms, food, uniforms, and other necessary supplies. They had hoped that a long war would cause the North to just simply give up and stop fighting. But the Gettysburg Address made it very clear that the North would not give up. Southerners were asked to grow food crops rather than cash crops like cotton to be able to feed the soldiers, to be able to continue to fight the war. Rebels began to desert in greater numbers, and Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Constitution left little room to lead effectively. Basically, they were not as effective in their leadership as Abraham Lincoln was in the North. Abraham Lincoln, having gone through 5 generals in 2 years, finally appoints Ulysses S. Grant as head of the Union Army. Ulysses S. Grant fights a war of attrition, which means that they did not capture Southern soldiers any longer. They were instructed to kill the Southern soldiers so that they would not be able to be replaced. It also meant that the Northern Army was actually suffering very heavy losses as well. In this picture, you can see that Ulysses S. Grant is conferring with General Meade, probably over strategy for an upcoming battle. Grant appoints William Tecumseh Sherman to lead the Union Army into the Deep South. General Sherman believed in total war, as well as Ulysses S. Grant, which meant that they were going to attack civilians and destroy their homes and their food and their fields if they were growing crops, since they were supplying goods for the Southern war effort to be able to continue. This is General William Tecumseh Sherman. Grant's war of attrition was devastating to the Southern Army, who didn't have a lot of soldiers to begin with. Grant knew that he could replace each of his dead soldiers, but that the South could not. General Sherman is going to begin his march to the sea by taking his troops from Tennessee through Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia. His men will burn a path up to 60 miles wide through the South, burning crops, poisoning wells, killing livestock, and turning railroad rails into Sherman's neckties, which can be seen here as they have pulled up all the little individual railroad wooden pieces, and then the rails themselves that the railroad had traveled on can be seen here. And that's how they left them all over the South, destroying the South's transportation network. General Sherman sends news to Abraham Lincoln in December 1864 that his Christmas gift to the president would be the city of Savannah, Georgia. He had been successful in his march to the sea. Then he turned north to help Grant defeat Lee. In the election of 1864, there were a number of people running, including President Lincoln, who was running for a second term. The Democrats were running General George McClellan, the Creeper, the Union Army general that Abraham Lincoln had fired for being too slow. At this point, the Democrats were tired of war, tired of the cost of war, and tired of the death toll. Republicans were looking for a candidate who would appeal to the Democrats to ensure that Abraham Lincoln would be reelected, and so they choose Andrew Johnson to be Abraham Lincoln's vice president. Johnson was a Southerner who never owned slaves. He was raised extremely poor, and he resented the planter class. He also looked down upon the slave class as well. Lincoln needed a few victories before the election, or he felt that he might lose. Sherman's sacking of Atlanta and Admiral David Farragut's control of the Mississippi River accomplished the victories that Lincoln was looking for. Absentee ballots from the Union Army put Lincoln over the top, and he wins the election of 1864. You can see that Abraham Lincoln was only president for barely 5 years. From 4 and a little more. From 1860, when this picture was taken, you can see how young and youthful he looked, and how the war took its toll on him. This picture was taken in 1865. You can often see when you look at presidents before they took office and then after they take office, you can see how much the stress ages them. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee knew that he had no choice but to surrender. His men begged him not to do this, but he replied that it would only kill them all if he continued to fight. He realized that the South had run out of supplies and were running out of soldiers, and they didn't have enough to be able to continue the war. So Jefferson Davis is going to actually set fire to Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital, to prevent Ulysses S. Grant from occupying it. This is a picture of what it looked like after the fall of Richmond, after the Confederate soldiers set fire to their own capital city. Appomattox Courthouse is where the surrender of the Civil War takes place, and Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant on April 9th, 1865. Lee says, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Grant was very generous with his terms of surrender, allowing the rebels to take their animals and personal items along with them. The Union band played Dixie as the men marched away following the surrender. The surrender was actually signed at Wilmer McLean's home in Appomattox Courthouse. This man actually had a home alongside the first Battle of Bull Run, and he had moved away from that battlefield to be able to get away from the war. And it seems kind of funny that it was just his destiny to be there at the beginning of the war in the house that he owned then, and then to have the surrender papers actually signed in his parlor when he moved to Appomattox Courthouse. We'll discuss more about the impact of the war and the surrender and Sherman's march to the sea in our lessons in class.